ॐ सहना भवतु सहनौ भुनक्तु सह वीर्यङ्करवावहै तेजस्विनावधीतमस्तु मा विद्विषावहै ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः नारायणं नमस्कृत्य नरं चैव नरोत्तमं देवीं सरस्वतीं व्यासं ततो जयमुदीरयेत्. So yesterday we were doing I'm neither the doer nor the enjoyer. Consciousness that is self-evident, which does not need to be revealed by anything else, is Atma, the self. The self alone is self-evident, and everything else is evident to the self. Atma, that is not the karta. The karta is something that comes and goes. For instance, there is no kartritva, no doership in deep sleep. Since I am always there, self evident, if I am the karta should not come and go. I should always be the karta. And if I am an enjoyer, bhokta, I should always be bhokta. But this is not so. Sometimes I am karta and sometimes I am bhokta. This means that I am neither karta nor bhokta. Karta appears when the mind antakarana is there. Doership, kartritva, means the status of being the subject with reference to any type of activity. Am I enough audible to everyone?
Yes, Prabhraji.
It's loud and clear because.
Very, very clear.
Okay. Just a second.
Jai Gurudev. Brahmaraji, you are on mute.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was on mute. Are you able to see the screen?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Definition of ego.
Definition of ego. So what I was saying earlier was this thing of karta and bhokta with respect to stula sukshma karana shariras is what we did revised yesterday when we went back to Tattva Bodh. Atma, without the Atma, there is neither kartritva nor bhoktritva. Right? Atma is self-evident, does not need to be revealed by anything. The self alone is self-evident. It is the karta is something that comes and goes. For instance, there is no kartritva, no doership in deep sleep. Since I am always there, if I am the karta should not come and go. I should always be the karta. And if I'm an enjoyer bhokta, I should always be bhokta. But this is not so. Sometimes I am karta and sometimes I am bhokta. This means that I am neither karta nor bhokta. So here, because yesterday I had a doubt of whether in deep sleep, when the person says, I had a deep sleep, I did not know anything, isn't there a kartritva there in the sense that he's able to perceive that he had deep sleep? So that perception itself is like a mental activity. So isn't that kartritva is what my question was. But here the
But
understanding,
Jai
yeah,
Gurudev, but that happens only after the deep sleep, not during the deep sleep,
correct.
right?
That is true. That is true. So there is only bhoktritva at that point. You're going through that deep sleep and you're able to say, yes, I had a deep sleep. So in order for karta or bhokta to be real, to be eternal, you require them to be there all the time. Unlike the Atma, they come and go. And without the Atma, there is no karta or bhokta. Right? But karta or bhokta is not the Atma. For karta, you require antakarna. Let me know if the voice is okay because the internet might be a little. Here I can see it is full, but just let me know because I've just
No, it
changed
is
my.
perfect. It is
It's fine.
perfect,
Okay.
Brahmaraji. Very
Karta
clear.
appears when the mind antakarna is there. Doership kartritva means the status of being the subject with reference to any type of activity, whether it is mental, like perception, inference, and thinking, or physical activity. For any type of activity, a subject is always necessary, and this subject is called the ego or ahankara or karta. The word ego must be understood well because there are a number of problems associated with its general use. So ultimately, the subject of any activity is the antakarna, the ego. And what is the definition of ego? Ego is that which owns up to any type of activity. For example, when I see, I say, this is my thing. or behind hearing, tasting, smelling, thinking, or doing anything is what is meant by the karta or the ego or ahankara. To say that one should surrender one's ego to the Lord is a very common statement that is much too simplistic in terms of understanding what is meant by surrender. First of all, I do not know who or what the Lord is. And why should I surrender the only ego that I have to this Lord? As it is, I have only a few things, and these things are owned by this ego. If I surrender it to the Lord, what will I get in return? Everything, I am told. The question that would arise would be, if the ego is already surrendered, who will get everything? Once I have surrendered my ego, I become totally decimated. Then who is there to get anything out of that surrender? Nobody. Therefore, that type of surrender is useless. Also, the next question is, who is surrendering the ego? Somebody has to do the surrendering. It is the ego that has to surrender itself, and that is not possible. Again, if I'm wearing a coat, I can surrender the coat. I can hang it somewhere or put it on someone's shoulders. Also, when I'm the owner of the coat, it is easy to surrender it. If I'm not the owner of the coat, I can ask you to take it, but I cannot surrender it because it does not belong to me. Similarly, I'm told that the ahankara, the ego, belongs to the Lord and that I must surrender it. How can I surrender what does not belong to me? I can only surrender what belongs to me. And if it belongs to the Lord, how is it that I do not know this? In fact, I think that everything belongs to me, including why else would I address him as my Lord? To address the Lord, I must be there. Because I'm here, he is the Lord. If I'm not here, where is the Lord? He is the Lord because I call him Lord. And if there is a Lord, and this Lord includes everything, then I have nothing to surrender. I have only to know. And if there is a Lord, and this Lord includes everything, then I have nothing. If I have to surrender to a Lord who is separate from me, then I am the ego. Who then is to surrender this ego? The ego alone has to surrender. How can the ego surrender? The one who surrenders is the ego. And being the one who surrenders, the ego can only surrender what it owns. The owner cannot be surrendered. If the ego has to surrender to the Lord, something else must be there to surrender it, which can only be another ego, because whoever owns up to the act of surrender is the ego. The ego requires an ego, which requires yet another ego. Thus, we find ourselves in infinite regression. How then are we going to surrender our ego to the Lord? So, if I have to surrender the ego, and I then, after I surrender, I'm going to get everything, who is that who's going to get everything? That is the first question. The second question is, if the ego belongs to the Lord and I should surrender it, how can I surrender what does not belong to me? And then, if there is the Lord that includes everything, he should include the ego as well. Right? So, if you're surrendering this ego, who then is to surrender this ego? The ego alone can surrender. So you require then, based on this line of thinking, you require another ego to surrender the ego. So this goes on and on. So this is not what is to be done. It is not surrendering the ego. It is understanding. Surrender is an attitude. Surrender is an attitude, a there is no other surrender than this. Surrender as such is not possible for the ego because it cannot surrender itself. But with an attitude of surrender, I can deflate the ego. I can appreciate that there is nothing in this creation that is authored by me, that everything is given to me, including my physical body, mind, and senses. What is given to me is not mine. When I say, I am just a trustee, O Lord, you are giver. The ego is what tells me all this. Thus, surrender can be only in terms of attitude. And this is the attitude of the karma yogi, isn't it? The karma yogi comes from the attitude and understanding that Ishvara is the karma phaladata. You are, of course, doing karma, but who gives you the results of your actions? Are you the author of the results? You are not, because you do not know what will happen. There are three things that can happen out of your result. Exactly what you expect it to be, completely opposite, or a mixture. Neither of which we know. So we are limited in our knowledge. We are alpajnaha. As ajnanis, we are alpajnaha. Whereas the Lord is sarvajnaha. He knows the in and out of everything. So therefore, what is surrender? Surrendering the ego is actually an attitude that the I that keeps coming up then gets deflated when you say, I am given everything. I am not the author of my results. There is nothing in this creation that is authored by me. Of course, what results we get are, we put up the blueprint ourselves by what we do. But what the results are for the actions that we do, we are not the author of that. So when we come from that attitude, the ego gets deflated. Then how does one get rid of samsara? Only by getting rid of the ego, the karta. And if surrender is not possible, how does one get rid of the ego? In the name of getting rid of everything else, the ego remains in one form or the other because it cannot get rid of itself. It remains to say things like, I am the most charitable person around. Even a person who does not talk about his or her good actions may think of himself or herself as a humble person and say, I never mention all of the charities I have done. I don't boast about them. Ask anyone and they will tell you that this is so. The ego knows very well how to sustain and perpetuate itself in so many ways. So the ego remains. The ego perpetuates itself. The person who says, oh, I do not tell everyone what I do, what seva I do, it is the ego that is speaking. Because the ego, the karta, is always there in one form or the other, it cannot be defeated except by the one who undertakes an inquiry into who am I. A person can study every philosophy there is, and the ego will remain saying, I am a philosopher. Only when the question, who am I, is asked, is the ego in trouble. Why? Because the ego, the karta, is really an imposter, a superimposition. There is no kartritva, no doership in fact, because it is mithya, dependent upon Atma. Although there are terms of saying surrender the ego, actual surrender is, is an understanding, is an inquiry, who am I? Otherwise, you end up having a spiritual ego. From having a normal ego, when one is pursuing knowledge, he develops a spiritual ego, saying, oh, I am studying this. I am doing sadhana. I am studying the Bhagavad Gita. So that I always remains. It's not easy to let go of that. But you inquire, who am I? That is when the ego dissolves. The ego is in trouble. Why? Because superimposition. When you go back, so the snake no longer remains. You're holding on to that concept of the snake on the rope. But once that who am I, that inquiry is there, and the knowledge dawns that, array, this is not a snake, it is only a rope. So where is the question of the snake being there? So the ego disappears. It dissolves. And then the Atma is, you don't need to, that is enlightened. Gurudev says, has not said enlightened, because that makes no sense. It is only the ego, the spiritual ego that is speaking. He's assuming he's enlightened. If he's actually enlightened, there is no kartrutva there. So I am enlightened, that statement itself will not show up. So there is no kartritva, no doership in fact, because it is nitya, dependent on Atma. I think this will be a good exercise for all of us to do. After we've done this study, this reading and understanding, at some point of time during the day or after we finish our meditation, it's good to ask this question, who am I? Either in the morning when we wake up or in the night before we sleep. At some point, whenever it is possible for us, spend some time inquiring, who am I? And that will slowly create that little space between all that we perceive, think, do, act, experience. So slowly, gradually, we'll be getting into the Sakshi Bhav.
Yeah,
Unless the Antakkara, huh?
better in the daytime. Otherwise, you'll know in the night we'll keep ढूंढते रह जाओगे.
ढूंढते रह जाएंगे. Yeah. Unless, of course, sleep overtakes you. And even with respect to Patanjali, he says what? Abide in the seer. Abiding in the seer is when your mind is not caught up in any of the other five vrittis, which is pramana, vikalpa, viparyaya, nidra. Just give me 1 second, huh? Negation by knowledge. When the truth of oneself is recognized, the ego does not go, strictly speaking. But rather, this recognition is what makes one see the ego as mithya. I repeat this: when the truth of oneself is recognized, the ego does not go, strictly speaking. Rather, this recognition is what makes one see the ego as mithya. The going of the ego then is purely in terms of negation, badha, or destruction, nasha, by knowledge. The word destruction is generally used in a physical sense, such as destroying an object so that it no longer exists in that form. Here, destruction of the ego is purely in terms of negation, badha. Negation by knowledge occurs when an object is there, but in reality is taken away. Negation by knowledge occurs when an object is there, but its reality is taken away. For example, you can enjoy the blue sky and at the same time, knowing that the sky is not really blue, dismiss its blueness. Or enjoying a movie, you can dismiss its reality. A child, on the other hand, cannot dismiss the movie as unreal because for the child, the elephants, tigers, and everything in the movie are real. The child may even cry, not knowing that the objects and situations in the movie are only appearances and therefore mithya. Until the child knows the movie is mithya, the movie will remain real. This knowing comes by negation, badha, understanding an object or situation and removing the reality of it. Similarly, the ego is not removed, but the fact that it has no independent existence is understood. And what does the ego that everyone has depend upon? What is it that exists independently without depending on the ego upon which everything else depends? The ego depends for its existence on the self, which is not the ego. Therefore, the self is the truth of every ego. There is one truth for every ego, and everything that is done by the ego, and that truth, Satya, is called Atma or the self. The self is the very content of the ego. Without ego, this one Satya, Atma, is not the ego and is a karta. Then who is the karta? The ego alone is the karta. To be a karta, you must have thought, and this thought has its being in I, consciousness. Therefore, you say, I am the doer. Doership itself is a thought centered on I. What is to be understood here is that while thought is centered on I itself is not centered on thought. While thought is centered on I, without the I, there is no thought. But I is not centered on thought. I is independent of the thought. Recognition of this fact is not the elimination or removal of thought. It is understanding. Understanding the truth of I. Beautiful. Recognition of this fact is not the elimination or removal of thoughts, but it is the recognition, understanding the truth of I. That is why the Jnani, as though sees, he says, Pashyan Shrinvan Sprishan Jigran Ashnan Gachan Swapan Swashan Pralapan Visrijan Grinnan Unmishan nimishannapi. Indriyartheshu. The Indriyas are moving around themselves. He is only witnessing them. How does one know Atma? How does the ego know the Atma, you may ask? The ego generally knows everything else, but how can it know Atma not being an object of the ego? In response to this question, there are those who will say the Atma will transcend the ego and you will know. But what does transcending the ego mean? Does the ego go away? Does it come back? If the ego goes away, there is no one there. And if having transcended the ego does not come back, who will be there to know the Atma? If such were the case, knowledge would amount to a vegetable. If the ego is transcended, in order to know Atma, it is definitely not going to come back. Therefore, this explanation is not acceptable. We should not just get caught up in these words, in the jungle of words, of saying surrender the ego, number one. There is no surrender. It is only an attitude. It is an understanding. It is a recognition. Second, transcending the ego is also a jungle of words. If you transcend the ego, understand the Atma, and the ego comes back, who is it that understood the Atma? It is the ego that has to understand the Atma. These kind of statements about surrendering the ego and transcending the ego in order to understand the Atma are very confusing to people. Unfortunately, they are too often to be found in the modern books on Vedanta and must therefore be seen for what they are. So we may come across terms like surrender the ego by in the knowledge that we read and judgment of who is saying that. It's just that we get the gist, the principle behind what is being said. We understand that surrendering the ego actually is an attitude. It is deflating the ego when you say everything is given to me. I am not the author of the results of my actions. And when you inquire, who am I? The understanding that dawns out of that inquiry, who am I? As though dissolves the ego. When you realize that ego is only a superimposition, it's only mithya. So we should not judge people and say, oh, they're saying surrender, they're saying transcend, so they're not right. So let's not go into that. We're not here to judge people and what they're saying. Let's get the gist of it. The means of knowledge are for the ego alone. Because innately, all of us have this tendency of saying right and wrong, because the intellect is uppermost. It tends to judge. It tends to categorize things into right and wrong, black and white, all the time. But what we are talking of, self-knowledge, intellect. We use the mind and the intellect in order to understand, but it is something that is beyond logic. The means of knowledge are for the ego alone. In fact, the ego alone uses the pramana, the means of knowledge available, perception, inference, and so on. The ego, ahankara, uses perception and analyzing the data gathered by perception gains inferential understanding also. Thus, perception and inference are in the hands of ahankara, the ego, the karta, the subject, who Wielding these two instruments of knowledge, perceives and infers. A means of knowledge is always employed by a subject who is the karta. Therefore, in the employment of any means of knowledge, there is a subject karta, an instrument karana, action kriya, and the result of action karma phala. So, four things here: karta, the person who employs the means of knowledge, the subject karta; karana, an instrument, the means of knowledge; action kriya, the actual process of getting to that knowledge; and the result of action karma phala. So, whether a piece of knowledge or an action produces a result or not, there is always a karta behind it. Perception and inference wielded by the ego are not going to help you know Atma, because Atma is the very essence of the ego. Atma is that which is behind the ego, meaning it is the truth of the ego. How then is the Atma to be known? This is where Agama Pramana, revelation in the form of words, Shabda, comes in. When Shabda is the Pramana, the means of knowledge, the ego does not do anything. What happens is that Shabda creates a thought, a vritti, showing you that you are the Atma, that is Brahman, and not the ego. The consciousness that is Atma, which is limitless, is you. This is the teaching, the Upadesha, and it removes your ignorance of yourself. I will read this last para again. So, how is the Atma to be known? Because for any means of knowledge, there are four things required: karta, karana, kriya, and the karma phala. So there is this karta behind acquiring any means of knowledge. Then how then is the Atma to be known? Atma is the very essence of the ego. It is because of the Atma the ego exists. So here is where the Shabda Pramana comes in, Agama Pramana, where the thought, the vritti is introduced, saying, you are the Atman, you are Brahman, Tattvamasi, and not the ego. The consciousness that is Atma, which is limitless. And here in this, when Shabda is the Pramana, the means of knowledge, the ego does not do anything. But isn't the ego listening to the Shabda Pramana? And also understanding it. So what happens is that Shabda creates a thought, a vritti, showing that you are the Atma, that is Brahman, and not the ego. The consciousness that is Atma, which is limitless, is you. This is the teaching, the Upadesha. And it removes your ignorance of yourself. That is why Vedanta had to bring in the Rajya Sarpa Bhranti, for us to understand how this happens, how that vritti. Because as long as there is darkness, as long as there is ignorance, the rope appears to be the snake. But the moment that knowledge comes, or the moment there is light shown on the rope, there is the snake, it disappears. Similarly, when with that inquiry, self-inquiry, vichara, nididhyasana that is done on who am I, and with this agama pramana that says tattvamasi, So that light, when that light shines, then this superimposition that we have, that Atma is, that the ego is the Atma, or the Atma is the ego, that disappears. So, therefore, the consciousness that is Atma, which is limitless, is you. This is the teaching, the Upadesha, and it removes your ignorance of yourself. So, here again, it is difficult for us to comprehend this with our limited intellect. Here again is where Shraddha is required. Because you can go on and on saying how. But there have been masters in the past who've been enlightened, who are saying it. And from whose that parampara, the Guru Shishya parampara, the Sampradaya has been teaching this. So what we need to have is just the Shraddha. Because somewhere in the intellect, there is this doubt. There is, oh, how is this possible? How is it? So that how will transfer into a realization once we have that Shraddha and move forward in this knowledge and continue to do what is to be done. Continue the self-inquiry. It would not happen if one is just doing it at a superficial level. It is only concepts that we gain. But actually doing the Nididhyasana. That is why Shravana, Manana and Nididhyasana. That's why Gurudev harps so much about meditation. Because only through meditation we can attain that stillness of the mind. Otherwise, the mind is in a constant flux, thought after thought. Not that your meditation need not have thoughts. You might have thoughts, but you're getting deeper and deeper into the more and more you're establishing the witness consciousness there. So then you're developing a gap between you, the witness, and what is happening to you. Whether it's outside of you physically in the physical plane, or it's happening inside of you in the physical body, in the antakarana. You're able to see a difference, a distinction between you, the intellect, you, the judging capacity, you and the ego. Does anyone want to share anything? So the destruction of self-ignorance. So the original sin we saw earlier was what? Original sin is ignorance. Samsara is a notion. And it is the cycle of karta, kama, of avidya. It starts with avidya. Avidya, kama, karma, karma phala, and janma. So this cycle continues. Because every karma phala needs to be exhausted by experiencing it, by going through it. Therefore, you have another janma. And karma phala, as long as you're with that karta bhav, you have punya or papa, sukha or dukkha. So therefore, the original sin is ignorance, avidya. So the destruction of self-ignorance. A person who takes himself or herself to be the ego thinks, I am only this much. Nothing more is known about oneself than this. This ignorance, because of which the ego is there, is destroyed by the vritti, I am Brahman, which is born out of the teaching. With the destruction of this ignorance, the notion that I am the ego disappears. Nothing more is necessary. I repeat this: a person who takes himself or herself to be the ego thinks, I'm only this much. Nothing more is known about oneself than this. This ignorance, because of which the ego is there, is destroyed by the vritti, I am Brahman, which is born out of the teaching. With the destruction of this ignorance, the notion that I am the ego disappears. Nothing more is necessary. What happens to the ego in the wake of self-knowledge? When the ego comes, it comes. And when it goes, it goes. But you are no longer the ego because ignorance about the Atma has already been destroyed. You know that the ego is Atma, whereas Atma is not the ego. Knowing this, you do not get lost in or caught up by the ego and its activities. This knowledge of Atma, once gained, is never lost because you have no more ignorance about Atma. Even if the ego comes, Atma cannot be mistaken as the ego anymore. Ego is Atma, but Atma does not become the ego just because the ego came. Just because a perception comes or an inference is made, just because an action is done or a result is gained, just because something happens, Atma does not become the ego. Everything is Atma. Atma eva idam sarvam. And Atma is not any of them. When, when any action is done, the ego is there. But Atma is free from all action because it is not the ego. Similarly, the means of doing an action or its result is also Atma, whereas Atma is neither the means, the doing, or the result. This truth being known, the person sees actionlessness in action. Karmani akarma darshanam. What a long, lengthy discussion on this beautiful verse, right? So, for an enlightened person, the ego can come and go, just like how thoughts come and go. But his understanding that ego is Atma, but Atma is not ego, that does not shake. Atma eva idam sarvam. Everything is Atma, but Atma is not any of them. Without us being exposed to this concept that Brahma Satyam Jagan Mithya, Jivo Brahmaiva na Paraha, we would not even get to this understanding, right? So someone who's completely not totally exposed to Vedanta, say for example, Trump came into my mind for some reason. So he doesn't even know what Vedanta is. To him, who is so full of ego, this makes no sense, right? So it is to get exposed to this knowledge, you require that pramana, and that agama pramana is in the form of a shabda. Tattvamasi. And when we ruminate upon that, contemplate upon that, with the self-enquiry, then the understanding dawns that I am Brahman and nothing else. And everything is Brahman. Even the ego is Brahman. The mind is Brahman. But Brahman is standalone. It's because of Brahman you have everything else. But Atma, Brahman, is not the ego. I think we'll stop here. Wait a second, I think. Yeah. We have a few minutes left if you want to pause here and do Manana before we'll read the next part from tomorrow. The next thing is about the Astra and Shastra and how knowledge is in the form of the Astra, Brahmastra. It comes and hits you. Okay, let me just read this if no one is. Yeah. So, knowledge is the only way to destroy ignorance about Atma. Agama alone, knowledge in the form of words alone, destroys the ego because you are not really wielding a pramana here. Rather, you are exposing yourself to the pramana, to the words. In fact, you are so exposed that you get shot by the spear of Brahman called Brahmastra. In the Ramayana, Rama used the Brahmastra to kill Ravana. Astra means a weapon that leaves your hand, and Shastra is that which remains in your hand. The various forms of practice, such as prayers, rituals, and so on, are called Shastra, whereas the statement Tatvamasi, you are that, is called Astra. It comes from a teacher and hits you. It is intended to hit you, in fact. The statement comes out like a bullet and hits the exposed, the ego, causing it to die. When the ego gets exposed to the teaching, Tattvamasi, it naturally dies, just as the many-headed weapon demon Ravana did when he was shot by the Brahmastra. Tattvamasi, the Brahmastra, destroys the ego called Ravana once and for all. Rama tried various methods to destroy his enemy Ravana, but nothing happened. He would remove one head, but by the time he destroyed the second head, the first one was back again. This is like trying to remove all our desires. Just when we think one is gone, we find that another one has popped up in its place. Finally, Rama was told to use the Brahmastra. Only then did Ravana die. Only then did Rama get back his joy, Sita. When the weapon Tattvamasi is used against the exposed ego, it is destroyed. Thus, you need not do anything except expose yourself to the teaching. This difference between employing perception and inference and exposing yourself to the teaching is what distinguishes this particular means of knowledge from all others. Exposing oneself to the teaching is lending oneself to an entirely different type of pramana operation. It comes from outside and destroys the ego by saying that you are Brahman. For this, no action is performed. You just expose yourself to the pramana with Shraddha, the faith that the pramana will give you self-knowledge. That is all that is required. Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana with Shraddha. We'll stop here. Om Loka Samasta Sukhino Bhavantu. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat Shri Krishnarpanamastu. Jai Gurudev. Bela, if you're able to chant that shloka, please go ahead.
Yeah, Jai Gurudev. एकमेवाद्वितीयं ये ब्रह्म निर्गुणं निश्चलं निर्विकारम् एकमेवाद्वितीयं ये ब्रह्म अत्र वेदान्तमेव प्रमाणम् बोधक सद्गुरु तत्त्वनिष्ठः ईश्वरानुगृहीतेन वेद्यम् एकमेवाद्वितीयं ये ब्रह्म ज्ञानगम्यं तुरीयं हृदयस्थम् आत्मरूपं हि तत् येन ज्ञातम् सोऽध्वनः पारमाप्नोति सत्यम् एकमेवाद्वितीयं हि ब्रह्म ब्रह्मज्ञस्य तु ब्रह्मैव सर्वम् नास्ति मोहो भयं नैव दुःखम् तस्य स्वानन्दमग्नं हि चित्तम् एकमेवाद्वितीयं हि ब्रह्म एकमेवाद्वितीयं हि ब्रह्म निर्गुणं निश्चलं निर्विकारम् एकमेवाद्वितीयं हि ब्रह्म ब्रह्मैव सत्यम्